And welcome to Tales from the Vault. In this episode, we focus on one of the greatest British Formula One teams of all time, Team Lotus. Established in 1954 by Colin Chapman, Lotus went on to win 6 drivers and 7 Constructors' World Championships between 1963 and 1978. Not only were they the dominant team of their time, but they also gave us some of the greatest racing drivers in history. Ladies and gentlemen, joining me to discuss Lotus, we have the son of the founder, Colin Chapman, and a man who now runs classic Team Lotus, Clive Chapman.
Hello, Peter.
Next, we have a true Lotus stalwart, a man who's been with the company for over, wait for it, 50 years and worked with some of the greatest names in motor racing. Bob Dance. And finally, joining us, we have a former Lotus driver and a man who won 3 Formula One races in his career, Sky F1's Johnny Herbert. And I'm pleased to say we also have with us Sky F1's Natalie Pinkham, who's among our studio audience. Natalie?
Indeed, and this lot love a spot of nostalgia, don't you? Looking forward to reminiscing with these lovely men? We'll be hearing more from them a little later.
Thanks, Natalie. Clive, I wanted to ask you about your dad and the early days and what you've been able to gain over the years, obviously talking to him, but also in all the work you're doing now with Team Lotus, about those early days, starting in 1954, and what drove your dad to achieve what he did so relatively quickly.
Well, he had great energy and clever man and a desire to win, I think. He was able to hook up with similar-minded people like Bob and a whole team of people. Not such a huge number of people in those days. You know, Team Lotus back then was, I don't know, 20, 30 people maybe.
Max.
Yeah. But between them, they did Formula One and Indy and touring cars and Formula Junior, and it was extraordinary what they achieved. And I think that's the same with motorsport today, is they still, everybody manages to achieve a fantastic amount.
I sniggered a little bit when you mentioned Bob there, only because I can imagine your dad finding all these talents and then maximising them. And Bob, I imagine life in the very early days when you joined, 1960, I believe, was pretty tough, long working hours.
Yes.
Not a lot of remuneration, I would guess. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth.
No, not too much, but that was a job I wanted to do. I wanted to become a race car mechanic, and Lotus was the nearest people to where I lived in North London. They were based at Hornsey originally, and then moved to Cheshunt, just out of North London, in 1959. And it was a place which was convenient to me because I was a race car enthusiast for 10 years prior to joining. So I had some idea of what it was all about, but not the inside of it all.
And what were your early impressions of Colin Chapman?
Dynamic, yes, always at speed in the factory. He would go round from department to department and look at what people were doing, ask them how they were approaching certain jobs or suggesting whatever should be. But yeah, he was respected and people feared him on occasions.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that fear, because he was obviously a born leader as well, if that's the right phrase, Clive. I mean, he ran this company. It grew exponentially, really, beyond all expectation, perhaps. I don't know. But your mum was a part of that foundation as well, wasn't she? She was very much a supporter of your dad from day one when it came to the little trials car.
Absolutely, and you know, she was as bold as he was, really, in terms of driving the cars and helping him with the business and lending him money to actually found Lotus originally. And there's some lovely old photos of Mum charging around in the early Lotuses, flat out, because my father had said, "Right, Hazel, through this corner, flat out, and you'll be fine." And famously, one time she did that and was actually quicker than Dad, because he didn't actually believe that she would go flat out through that corner. But yeah, together, they had an amazing adventure.
It's interesting you mentioned the pace. Your mum was quicker than your dad, but a lot of people out there will say your dad was actually a very talented racing driver in his own right.
Yeah, well, I went on a few journeys on the road with him, which were pretty exciting, but he was pretty quick on the track as well, and made it to the point of Grand Prix, Formula One, French Grand Prix. Unfortunately collided with his teammate in qualifying, so that was that. And I think he decided that he'd concentrate on the designing as opposed to the driving.
Quite early on, your father wanted to build road cars as well, alongside the racing cars, very early on in his history. And that makes him very different from the norm. I guess only for Enzo Ferrari would be the logical comparison there.
Yeah, I think the road cars were a way of funding the racing to a degree. But as much as anything, he was trying to make a business. And to begin with, I think he saw the road cars as a better option than the motor racing, because there wasn't a lot of money in motorsport in those days. It was only subsequently, really, that it became commercial. So road cars were an essential part of his plan.
It was a young Scot sliding a Lotus Elite around Brands Hatch that caught the eye of your father back in the late 50s, Jim Clark. And that really changed the way we think about Team Lotus and the way Team Lotus was progressing as a company, I think. And that, tell us about Jimmy, Bob, really first. The first time you met Jimmy and what your impressions were of him as a driver.
Well, I would have met him to speak to at factory, and didn't know much about him as such, although I was at the Boxing Day Brands Hatch meeting when he was driving a Lotus Elite against Clive's dad, and obviously putting on a good show between them. And I got to know him when I moved to Lotus Developments with Mike Costin, and he would come in from probably driving down from his farm in the borders of Scotland there, and you'd get introduced to him, and that's about all. And then you'd gradually get to know him along the way, and he would ask other people what the new bloke was like and things like that, you know, but quite an unassuming gentleman.
Unassuming, but incredible in a racing car.
Yes.
The contrast between his personality, and talking to Sir Jackie Stewart about it on occasions, he said he was a different person in a racing car, and I think that's something that is quite difficult to get one's head around. He was so unassuming and so much of a Scots farmer, and yet in this racing car he was a different man and just was brilliant from lap one always. Johnny, how do you perceive that in your mind, and when you think of Jim Clark and those two contrasting personalities?
I can probably sort of understand it, because obviously, you know, when I started out in karting and everything else, I was very, very shy, which I don't think Jimmy was exactly the same. So, okay, he did the sort of the driving tractors up at the farm, but I think his character was very, very quiet, very unassuming. But once he got in the car, there was that sort of skill set that came out and came into play, you know, massively. And I think it's something we still relate to drivers of today. But there are these special ones that sort of always jump out in front of you and sort of slap you in the face and sort of drive the wheels off a car. And Jimmy was one of those. And it didn't matter if it was a Lotus Cortina, or it was an F2 car, which sadly he lost his life in, or it was an F1 car. His ability to jump across those different formulas but be competitive at the same time was absolutely amazing.
50 years ago, he won. He didn't do the Monaco Grand Prix. Instead, he won the Indy 500, and then he came back into the Formula One Championship to win the Formula One World Championship. That achievement, Clive, will never be repeated.
That's right, and Formula 2 and Tasman Championship in the same season. And it's lovely that there is that unbeatable achievement, because it will stand forever.
And I guess that was a sign not only of the times, but also of Clark and Lotus, the variety of cars he was driving and the variety of disciplines. He was going from sports cars to the Lotus Cortina to the Indy 500 to Formula One, back to touring cars, sometimes racing 3 different cars on the same day. Don't you wish you could do that, Johnny?
I do, yes. I'll tell you what, the best time I sort of enjoyed was when I left F1, was able to do sort of GTs, touring cars, sports cars, because being able to adapt to all those different formulas as a driver is a challenge. And I think that's something that we saw back in sort of the 60s more so. And it's brilliant when you see the old movies from that era, because they look so good as well. And the guys were just so nice to everybody who was coming to watch the races at the same time, but then put on a show on track as well.
Well, very sadly, just after beating Fangio's record of 24 Grand Prix wins, he won his 25th. Jimmy lost his life in that Hockenheim Formula 2 accident. And then the team was was led obviously by your father, but then Graham Hill had to step in and take over that role, and it was much more than being a number one driver. This was about keeping the team together, and it was a pivotal moment in the team's history, I suggest.
Yeah, I mean, Graham had worked with the team since he started in motorsport as a mechanic to begin with, and then a driver, and had a very close relationship with my father. And I think he realised that my father was struggling to cope. Bob, you were on the team then. I think you were chief mechanic.
That's right.
And the Spanish Grand Prix was a more challenging than normal weekend.
Yes, unfortunately it was, because we lost Mike Spence as well at Indianapolis, and Clive's dad was at a very low ebb, and we wondered whether he would want to continue. But Graham said, come on, we've got to pick ourselves up and we've got to do something, you know. And we were out in Spain, Madrid, and we had the Lotus 49, which was the current car of the year, and a development of that. And Jim Enderwright was the racing manager at the time, and he rang Colin to see if we were going to run the new car. And he said, no, don't run the new car, just leave it in the track, just run the regular 49, which we did, and we won.
And you won.
Yes. And we didn't make any special efforts in terms of going to bed early or what have you. We got our work done, and Graham said, come on, lads, we're all going out to a flamenco dancing nightclub for the evening. And yeah, it all paid off in the end, so it did lift the morale and, of course, helped everybody.
And went on to win the World Championship that year. Just
That's right.
Staggering in the context of,
pretty tough
of what had
going, I
happened.
must admit.
In the gold leaf colours, Clive and Bob, what do you think about gold leaf versus green and yellow?
Well, from my father's point of view, he was entirely pragmatic throughout, and it was a way of getting more money and going faster. So,
Spoken like a true chap.
Yeah, the fact it was red, which was the Italian racing colours, couldn't have been a worse colour to choose, I guess. But I think, was the team bothered particularly?
The mechanics were a bit upset about it. But then the governor said, you know, if you want a job and you want to be paid, then we've got to get some money from somewhere. And so that's where the start of the sponsorship came in.
Yeah. Well, Lotus led the way there as well. Natalie, I think we've got some questions.
Yeah, talking of the wrong colours, I've got Davidson here in totally the wrong team kit for tonight's show, but we'll forgive him for that. What's your question, Davidson?
I just wondered, what was Jim Clark, the man, really like?
What was
Jim Clark, the man, really like? I think Bob's a good person to answer that, isn't he?
Oh, dear. Yeah, unassuming, very pleasant person, good driver, sense of humour. Bad points? Bad points. He used to bite his nails terribly before races. That was, you know, he was just a nice person to work with, and the thing you expected in the races was he was going to be out front, because he had this natural ability to get himself away at the start and build up a lead and stabilise that. And yeah, we expected to win because we had well-designed cars, 100% effort to make them reliable and competitive, and a first-class driver on board. What more could you want?
Well, thanks, Natalie, for that. Actually, the colours are not that far out because they did sponsor Lotus for a while.
There you go.
Yeah, so there you go. Yeah, Graham won that championship in '68, but your dad didn't lose much time in putting another very quick driver in the other car, Jochen Rindt, a driver he knew well, obviously, and was very charismatic in his own way, completely different character to Jimmy and Graham, and he won the championship in 1970. Underlining how good Lotus were as a team, but also very sadly clinching it posthumously after that accident at Monza. And I think, Clive, this is where you come into the frame, because you remember going to the British Grand Prix 70 at Brands Hatch.
Yeah, I remember watching the Monaco Grand Prix when Jochen won on the last lap on the telly, and then went to the British Grand Prix. Again, he won on the last lap when Brabham ran out of fuel. And,
Nothing to do with Ron Dennis.
No, not at all. There's a little bit of trouble in scrutineering afterwards.
Yes.
Eddie Dennis saying they had to, as they pushed the 72 into scrutineering, they wanted to put their knees into the rear wing stage
Ease
just
it
to try
down a
and
bit, yes.
ease it down a little
Yeah,
bit.
what's going on with the
And,
mechanics at that point, Bob?
Oh, well, the governor would tell them what to do, what was needed, yes, and they understood pretty well. And if
Yeah.
they wanted some prize money, they did what was asked of them.
And I suppose somebody's job was to distract the scrutineer while all this was going on as
It has
well.
been done,
Yeah.
yes. Various manoeuvres along the way.
Yeah.
Johnny, thoughts on Jochen Rindt after he's put out his cigarette and stamped it and climbed into the car?
Well, again, just when you look back, it's just how amazing that he was able to, again, get the best from himself, but from the team at the same time. And I think things like you're hearing Bob and Clive talk about, nothing sort of really changed. There were things that you had to do to win the race, that maybe sort of leaning on the back of the car just to get it through scrutineering. But then as a driver, that's something that you sort of knew about, and you had to sort of just sort of push that to the side and do the job on track. But I think the way he went about racing, it's a shame it was so short, really, his career in Formula One, because I think as a talent, I think he was absolutely massive, and he would have just gone on to bigger and better things, and maybe people like Emerson Fittipaldi may not have got a chance. You never know. It would have been a very different story.
I was talking to a fan the other day who was at the British Grand Prix in 70, and he says he remembers Jochen lining up in the cafeteria after he'd got the pole for the race, and he's lining up with everybody else to buy his fish and chips or whatever he's having, his shepherd's pie. Nobody around, just wearing his gold leaf jacket. No mechanics with him, nobody. No media people.
Yeah.
Where were they all?
Pre-motorhomes and pre kind of 72 when we went black and gold, and
Yeah.
then things changed.
Well, then things changed with Emerson Fittipaldi, just another star. And your dad had this ability, I think. Did he create the stars, or did he bring the stars to him? I mean, how do you see that? There was this mix of people: Clark, Hill, Rindt, Fittipaldi.
Well, it wasn't just the drivers, of course. It was the designers and the mechanics and the home-based crew as well. He seemed to be a bit of a beacon for people with talent. And, you know, it's Team Lotus, and without wishing to kind of go on about it, it really was a team effort. There's no way one guy could achieve all that. You know, from Len Terry, Maurice Philippe, and onwards, you know, there was a number of great designers in particular that he worked with that helped him realise what he did.
And amazing how history repeated itself, with Graham winning at Jarama in 68 after Jimmy's accident, and then Emerson winning at Watkins Glen so soon after Jochen Rindt's accident.
Yeah, I remember.
As the new team leader, if you like.
Yeah, Dad rang up and said to Hazel, "You're not going to believe this. Rainer Wiesel came third." And we were like, "Wow, that's amazing, amazing." And then he said, "And Emerson won it." And that was an extraordinary moment.
I've got to go to you again, Johnny, and say Emerson Fittipaldi in that time, that gold leaf Lotus 72, and how good he was. He just blitzed it in 72.
Yeah. Again, like Clive said, you know, the ability for Colin to be able to supply the drivers the equipment was one thing, but of course then actually being able to win the amount of championships and races was something else. But someone like, again, Emo, and the history I sort of know even after that, how he was able to get the best out of everything is pretty amazing. And just typical Emo, just got on with the job. There was no sort of issues with him. He was very much probably like your dad. I think he had the drive, he had the determination. I would imagine there were a hell of a lot of battles between the two, but when you put that together, it makes a pretty lethal weapon, and it certainly did on track.
It did, but not as lethal as the ground effect Lotus 79, which changed the face of Formula One, much as the Lotus 25 and the Lotus 49 had already done so in their own ways, but the 79 brought ground effect, which we're still using today, obviously. I guess there's one question, which is why they didn't do it sooner. And it's easy to say that in retrospect, not necessarily ground effect, but wings. It's amazing to me that it took so long for Formula One to discover wings and the effect of aerodynamics when Jim Hall had been running them for 2 years in sports cars.
Yeah.
Did you ever talk to your dad about that?
And particularly, but with ground effect, Peter Wright was really close with the March, I think, before he then came to Lotus and really reintroduced the idea. And Peter Wright's another example of a really clever guy that Dad worked with. And you know, he could have fallen onto ground effect 5-6 years previously, but just they got busy doing other stuff. And I think that was one of the things about Formula One. back then, I guess it's still the same today, is it's always flat out and you're always charging along and racing to catch up.
Absolutely.
Probably more hand to mouth back then. So any idea that didn't pay an instant dividend, just got forgotten.
Yeah. Well, we all remember that classic 76 Japanese Grand Prix that defined the World Championship that year in favour of James Hunt. But Mario Andretti won that race in a JPTL Lotus, and that really cemented a new relationship for your father that I think that in his own way probably he would put up there with Jimmy and with Emerson, I would guess, and possibly Graham.
And the relationship.
He and Mario, the belief.
Started back at Watkins Glen in '68.
Yep.
Yes, and previous to that he came to Monza to drive in the Italian Grand Prix, but that wasn't possible because he also had to race Saturday night in the States on a 1 mile oval, and he didn't have 24 hours rest before the actual Grand Prix at Monza, so he couldn't run. But
Mario tells the story that he reckons he would have been on the pole and would have won the race, and Ferrari bribed the organisers to come up with that rule, and enforce that rule. But anyway,
but at Watkins Glen, he asked Colin Chapman, "When do you want me to put it on pole, Colin?"
Wow.
And the old man said to him, well, take it out and give it a run, basically, and put the car on pole position. And Colin said, it's just like having Jimmy all over again. But he could say that and go out and do it without any fireworks. So just get on with the job.
Natalie, more questions?
Yeah, more fireworks from the audience.
Yes.
Richard, what's your question?
Yeah, obviously in F1 you'd have a lot of parties, but what was the best party you guys had at Lotus?
Ooh.
What was the best party?
I think we got the right man on the end of the sofa there.
Clive, you're the shy one, aren't you? No. Well, I think, Bob, you should start really, I suppose, the 60s. They seem to be something. Graham Hill, he comes to mind.
Yes, I suppose Graham could organise something. Graham Hill from Mill Hill, and he used to have a party in his garden. And all the lads after the Grand Prix would be off down to Mill Hill, and some of the drivers and everything, all good, light-hearted stuff. They were competitors on the track, but friends off the track. There's been lots of gatherings and fun along the way.
Who was the best bread roll thrower in the restaurants?
Well, the first instance of bread roll throwing I saw was when we'd won the 1963 World Championship. We were sponsored by Esso, and they invited the team to go down to Fawley, to their refinery, for a lunch and celebration. And that was all pretty formal stuff. I was fairly new with the team and everything. But one of the first bread rolls to be thrown was by Clive's dad. And there was always bread rolls flying and throwing about. It's frowned upon these days, of course. There's not so much of it. We might do some with you, but...
No, I know.
Yes.
We did in our day. We did back in the early 90s, that's
You've
for
had
sure.
trouble with us in the past.
Yeah, I have. You've had trouble with me, yeah. Both ways.
We'll get on to that in a bit. After the break, we look at the 1980s as Lotus continued to win races in Formula One and a future world champion came to the fore.
Up goes Elio De Angelis' hand, and the young Roman has won his first Grand Prix.
I'm very happy to be the one that managed to prove that the Lotus car is not only quick in qualifying conditions, but even on the race conditions.
And look at that, the Lotus team cheering, and Senna takes the checkered flag. The Detroit Grand Prix has been magnificently won by Ayrton Senna.
Welcome back. So far we've talked about the great success of Lotus. However, a lot of that was down to one man, the man who did it all. Businessman, engineer and designer. The one and only Colin Chapman.
Colin Chapman is inviting me to drive to Team Lotus. I was shaky.
From any driver standpoint, that's who you wanted to be with.
He was a most fantastic innovator and an engineer and lovely man. I mean, he basically became almost like my second father.
He was a genius. Colin had the intuition of getting a Grand Prix car right.
He was just so dynamic.
He was already thinking way ahead, always outside the box.
He was just so ahead of his time.
Clive, a man of enormous inspiration, obviously your father. I cannot imagine what the impact was like in '82, back end of '82, when you heard about the accident or heard that what had happened to him.
Well, obviously from a family point of view, very, very upsetting. And there was a lot of people that worked with my father who found it very difficult too, both at the car company and at the team. And I guess the immediate sense was, well, what do we do now? But I think credit to the people that my father worked with, in particular Peter Waugh, as far as Team Lotus was concerned. It was, you know, we've got to pick it up and go, much like Graham Hill back in 1968. And Peter really stood up and was ready to take it forward.
The legacy of Colin was so vast, it just continued on, didn't it? In the way the team was run and the ethos of the team and the pushing that went on afterwards was a testament to his own aggression and to his own feel for racing, I think.
Yeah, I think the modern phrase is DNA, isn't it? All the companies use it, including Lotus. But the people that worked with my father really had that character, and they all stuck together, including the drivers, Elio and Nigel, when undoubtedly other teams were trying to suggest they might like to drive for them instead. And my mother decided to keep the team going, and 3 years on, they managed to get back to winning a Grand Prix, which was a fantastic achievement.
The Nigel Mansell-Colin Chapman relationship was embryonic, of course, but it was not unlike the others that we've been speaking about so far, in that Colin believed in this driver, and equally Nigel was a star. Even though nobody knew it at the time, he was, and you could see the chemistry.
I think he recognised in Nigel a real spirit, a real character that he felt would do well in Formula One, particularly at that time. And so it proved to be, sadly not with Lotus, but later on.
And I don't say this lightly, Johnny. I don't even say it patronisingly, but I do say that it's a shame that he wasn't there when you were at Lotus, because you're the sort of guy he would have gone for as well, I'm sure of it.
Yeah, that's nice of you to say, and it's a shame I didn't meet him. I didn't meet Enzo Ferrari because I had my crash and he died later that year. But I did work a little bit with Peter Waugh, and I did a test at Monza when it was Nakajima and Nelson Piquet, and he was always very supportive. He had that similar sort of enthusiasm, it sounds as if Colin had, and he sort of carried that through, and he was very good to me in the car. Everything went very, very well. Then he popped his head in right near the end of the day and he said, well, don't tell anyone, but let's put a bit of qualifying boost in the car. So I reckon if you turn that to number 3 and then the fuel to number 4, you know, give it a bash. And they put new tyres on it. And I thrashed it. I didn't go any faster because he told me to put too much fuel into the engine itself, so I didn't actually get any more power. But it was that enthusiasm that carried on from what Colin did. But I think it's everything that you get from the 60s through to the 70s, where his enthusiasm for, like Mario said, thinking out of the box, thinking ahead. And that was such a strong thing. And that sort of was there till the very, very end. But I think historically, the way Colin is remembered by everybody is that ingenuity that was just so far ahead of everybody else.
Natalie, I think we got some more questions.
We do. Martin, very tall Martin, reach up here. What's your question?
I think I've answered some of that, but how should Colin Chapman be remembered?
How should Colin Chapman be remembered? How should Colin Chapman be remembered? Emphasis on the should there, I think. Bob?
Well, you've seen him remembered by the drivers on the screen. That's a great tribute. I respected him and still respect him for my life in motor racing. He should be remembered as an innovative engineer, an enthusiastic race driver, great businessman, and when he was relaxed with the lads, he was always good fun and everybody was happy. He had an ability to get the best out of people working for him. If they could stand the pace and the pressure, you were okay. If you couldn't, then it was best to go quietly into something else or be pushed.
I've got a quick story on how we actually did the deal with Nigel and got your old man to sign the contract, which was not an easy thing to do, as you've mentioned, because the financial side of racing was always slightly difficult if you're on the wrong side of the desk. And we did it by suggesting through the media and through various other sources that Nigel was about to sign a contract with March as some sort of test driver. So it's going back to 1980 when he had no chance to drive for anybody else at all. But we let this filter through to your father. And I'm not going to let March sign my men, so where's that contract? And just signed it like that. And it was pretty cool, actually, how we managed it. I don't think you could do that today, Johnny, sadly, that sort of thing. The other thing, I told Nigel to learn to fly very quickly, instructed him to do that, and he got his private licence in something like 15 hours. Because I said, one day you're going to be sitting next to Colin Chapman at dinner, and if you talk about flying, you'll be a Lotus driver forever, because that's what he loved. That was his second love, right?
Yeah.
He loved flying, and he went into the aviation business.
Yes, that's right.
In his own way. Then, sadly, without your dad, came another great star to Lotus, Ayrton Senna. He had his first year in Formula One with Tolman, but then very quickly moved to Lotus and was brilliant. John Player, Team Lotus, and then winning that Portuguese Grand Prix, I think, was possibly the iconic moment, I think, of that period, wasn't it? Peter Waugh after the race.
Yeah, that's right. And later in an interview with Nigel Roebuck, many years later, Ayrton would say, that was his greatest race. And Nigel said, well, what about Donington? He said, well, Donington, forget it, I had traction control. Estoril, it was all manual. And it was an amazing drive, and he was seconds quicker than everybody else and lapped nearly the whole field, and it was a big moment.
And I think as a result of that time at Lotus, Ayrton had this affinity, or began to get this affinity with Jim Clark. And he went up to Duns, and he began to really feel, I think, some of Clark's heritage and what Jim had been all about. That was the drive. I don't know, Johnny, perhaps you could give us your thoughts on that.
Well, that was Ayrton. There were incidents that happened on track. Ayrton would stop. Ayrton would go and have a look and see if everybody was okay. There was a real rare insight into what was going on in his head. He got criticised, I think, when he was racing. He was very sort of blinkered, and he didn't discuss things with the press, for example, in those days. But his main thing, which is very much like Lewis Hamilton now, is he's there on that Sunday to do a job, and to do that job the best way he can. And that, going up to Scotland to see Jim Clark, is exactly what the man was like. And I think that was that soft side that we probably didn't see very, very often. But it was there. I knew him when I was karting, and you always saw that soft side. But of course, you had to be harder when you got to Formula One, and that hardness, I think, turned him into the man that we saw on the racetrack.
Natalie, more questions, I think.
Yes, Ali, the mic's all yours.
Yeah. What was it like to work with Ayrton Senna?
What was it like to work with Ayrton Senna?
Yes. Great boost for everybody. He was a great test driver, and he had infinite patience to try things and run things for the engineers. He was definitely a great advantage to our company and our team. And I remember our first test with him in Rio, on home ground, as it were. So he was quite relaxed and happy, and we had a lot of little liquid crystal temperature readouts around the dash of the car for testing. And the engineers said, right, we'd like to know what the temperature is here and what it is coming out of there. And there's a whole list of stuff, really. And he said, well, I'm not going to be able to tell you everything that's going on there, but what I'll do, I'll go and do a run, and I'll tell you what that half is reading off, and do another run, and we'll see what the other half are doing. And he would test and work very closely with the engineers and with the mechanics. And he had a good sense of humour as well, off duty. He was also a great model aeroplane flyer. and he'd bring his aeroplanes along, especially out in Sao Paulo or Rio, and at the end of testing, we'd have some aeroplanes taking off and flying up amongst the buzzards and what have you in Rio.
Your father would have loved that, Clive. He would have loved radio.
Oh.
Did he ever play with radio control?
Well, I don't know if he'd have enjoyed the radio control planes, actually. But
would have found them too frustrating.
Exactly, yeah. He'd have crashed a couple and then stomped off. But he'd have certainly enjoyed working with Ayrton, for sure. I think he probably as close to Jim Clark as you could get.
And it was disappointing that he left to go to McLaren, really. Left what was a good package. John played.
Well, not as
Lotus,
disappointing, as exciting as it was when he was with us. So, you know,
yeah,
that's
true.
what we remember, really. And it was a fantastic few years for the team when he was with us.
Right, well, after the break, we'll look at the more recent years of Team Lotus, plus who we think was the greatest Lotus Formula One world champion. Welcome back. We've looked at the glory years of Lotus. However, unfortunately, as the 1990s progressed, the team found it harder to compete, and sadly, they were wound up in 1994. Enter Johnny Herbert and Mika Häkkinen and Julian Bailey, some good people, Pedro Lamy. It was a very different Team Lotus, but it was nonetheless a Formula One drive for you, and it was a team with enormous heritage. What was it like at that point, John?
Well, I'll tell you what, the spirit was still, I think, was still there. I think you know Peter Collins very well. Yeah, you worked together early on, around sort of when Nigel first got involved. And I think he still had that enthusiasm for Lotus. We still were trying very, very hard. Peter gave my first break with Benetton in '89, and then he got me back in for '91 with Mika. And, you know, he had two drivers that were hungry for it, who basically worked with each other. It was weird because we used to share the data and sort of say, well, I tried this gear and I tried that line, and he'd sort of swap it. But it helped us because we didn't have enough budget to test. So all our testing was at the Grand Prix weekend, and Peter sort of was able to manage that very, very well. And it gave us sort of a nice feeling that we were wanted, and second, that we were able to go battle head-to-head on track. So it was a very healthy time in '91 and '92. And then, sadly, it just seemed to just wane off through '93 and then especially through '94.
Yeah, what were your emotions at that point, Clive? I mean, it's an obvious question in a way, but, you know, how did you see that period?
Well, my family decided that somebody else should try and give it a go because we weren't being terribly successful. And we felt Peter Collins and Peter Wright were the dream team because they both worked closely with my father. And as Johnny says, to begin with, it was looking pretty good. But then they hit financial trouble, and Formula One as a whole was in a kind of bit of a dip. And just at the very bottom, they probably represented the real low point. That's where they hit the deck. And then Formula One recovered. But sadly, Team Lotus was left behind. And obviously, not having a Lotus on the grid was extremely disappointing.
And it was difficult because obviously, was it '90, the end of '90, it's sort of, that was when there was the changeover from sort of Peter Waugh to Peter Collins and Peter Wright. And then it sort of started off '91. We had a great car eventually when we got it in Monaco in '92, and we got some really competitive races under our belt. Mika then left for McLaren for '93 as the test driver. And then we sort of had Alex Zanardi, Pedro Lamy sort of join in '93, '94. But it was a nice environment, again, to work in, you know, and the mechanics were fantastic. They'd all come from that latter success that they'd had in the sort of the '80s, mid-'80s. And it was a really nice environment to be in. But like Clive said, unfortunately, budgets didn't really come their way. I had lots of sponsorship all over the car, but the core budget needed just wasn't there. And I think it was the debt that got them in the end.
And Bob, what were you doing at that point? Was Johnny giving you any grief, or...?
Johnny?
Yeah.
He never gave us grief at all.
Oh,
never.
Saying that now. Yeah.
I think we gave him some. Yeah. Yes.
You did, all did, I have to say, yeah. But that was the environment that we had. There was a fun environment at the same time. But when you had to do the job as a driver or as a mechanic, everybody was able to just switch over and do the job straight away. So it was wonderful for me because it was a lovely experience to have in that sort of 91, 92 with Mika especially, and then unfortunately, but learn a lot from the difficulties that basically they had in 94.
And then today we have Lotus F1. How do you feel about that, Clive? And it's doing quite well again now, so that's the good news. And we know Kimi's won races with them, which is nice.
Yeah, absolutely. I was in a bar in Tokyo, a Ferrari bar, and bizarrely, and Kimi won the race, so that was pretty exciting. But for my mother, for example, to her it's Lotus on the grid, and she's excited when they do well and disappointed when they don't. And the badge is on the car, and great for the brand, and you know, for Colin Chapman's grandchildren, there's 7 grandchildren, they love to see the Lotus name in Formula One.
I bet they do. Now tell us about Classic Team Lotus, because you're not just sitting up there building cars all quietly, are you? You've got a full race program of your own, one that your father would be proud of.
Well, it's frankly a bit of a cottage industry, but there's 15 of us full-time now, and we're prepping 18 cars for customers for 26 events this year. Historic motorsport, as you know, has really grown fantastically in the last 20 years since I started Classic Team Lotus. And the standard is really high. End of this season, we're going to the Austin Grand Prix with 4 of our customers. There's going to be 38 cars on the grid for the Formula One support race. Top half dozen guys will match the times that were done in period, which is a little bit scary. Yes. You think that the cars are now 40 years old a lot of the time. But it's really nice to look after the old cars, working together with Bob, who's still doing 3 days a week. My sons are now involved in the business. In their holidays, they're reading engineering. And you know, we've got some young people who've joined the company, working together with Bob. Chris Dinage, who's team manager, who was with the team in the 80s and 90s as well. Johnny remembers him. And it's really nice to keep the cars going. At the end of the day, the cars are the stars. And to look after Jim Clark's car for the current owner, Bob looks after Jimmy's 63 championship-winning car, takes it to Monaco, puts it on pole, wins the race and turns around and says, that's how it used to be. You know, that's how Team Lotus is meant to go racing.
Oh, and tell us about this Lotus 49B. Is it a B, I think, you're doing up now?
Yes, we've got a very nice car in for restoration, which Adrian Newey acquired last year. He's a big fan of Lotus. His father was a Lotus owner, and it's nice that he's entrusted us with the restoration. And Bob's been involved, but one of our younger mechanics, Kevin Smith, has become a bit of a 49 expert. Yeah. And it's really nice to restore the car. It's very original, but it's been away for a long, long time, just to get it back to exactly how it should be in work spec and to have it running reliably. That's the key thing. And I'm sure that Adrian will be taking it to numerous events to show it off. And,
I thought you were going to say take it to the absolute extremity of every racetrack on which he sits in it.
No. He's very keen to give it a go. I think he might race it one day, but he's also very keen to have it original, which is nice.
Natalie, I think we got some more questions.
I think Simon would like to... Didn't you say you'd like to know how much that Lotus costs? No?
Yeah, I'd love to know.
No, I don't think you'll be told, though. But what is your question?
Question to Johnny. What's your favourite Lotus moment?
My personal one, or just when seeing him on track? Well, I think the most incredible time I remember watching, but also being involved with as well, was the electronic suspension, the active suspension. They were awesome pieces of kit, because the amount of different setups that you had were far too many for the whole time that sort of active suspension was about. You go back to Ayrton, you know, back in those mid-80s, and absolutely brilliant stuff. And then when we had it in 93, the system itself, I have one story in Barcelona, and we weren't doing too well. I think we were about 18th or something or other. But as I left to go to the grid, left the pits, there was just a bit of twitching going on as I went round. So we got round to the grid, stopped, and just before I turned it off, it was sort of twitching, and it was on the right corner. So we turned it off, computers went on, a bit of playing went on, started it up, it was still twitching. Then we did the parade lap to the grid itself, and they jumped over the wall again, which would be frowned upon nowadays, plugged the computer in, did it all again. Couldn't fix it, and then they jumped off with about 15 seconds to go before the start, and it was still twitching about. But as I took off, it all seemed to sort of calm down. And for the first 4 laps, I think it died, unfortunately, after about lap 6, but for the first 4 laps, the right rear wasn't working at all. It was like just a broken, limp piece of suspension on the back. But the other 3 were able to compensate, and you could literally go not quite as quick as it would with the four wheels, but it was just unbelievable how it controlled it. Over curbs, the wheel went up here. Monocoque stayed exactly where it was. And those are exciting times. For me, 93, OK, not as competitive, but of course when Ayrton had some brilliant races with the original active car as well. And with John Miles.
Monaco and Detroit.
But John Miles did a lot of work, who was a Lotus man in the early 70s. But he basically sort of helped develop the active suspension on Sid. The Lotus Esprit at Hefford as well.
Right, gentlemen.
Yeah, very special.
The greatest Lotus Formula One world champion. Not an easy question to answer, but I won't influence any of you by showing you this copy of the Indianapolis News as it was published in Victory Circle, 1965, Indianapolis. He wasn't bad, this one, Jim Clark. But anyway, Clive.
Well, I never met Jimmy. Fortunately, there's some excellent documentaries. And working together with people like Bob, I've got to know him a little bit, and my mother's told me a lot about him. But it would be Jim Clark.
Bob?
I suppose it has to be Jim Clark. You know, I've met lots and lots of drivers, and there's great drivers from all the different eras, favourites of mine. But I suppose Jim Clark was a real Lotus man.
Yeah, and I think a gentleman from my point of view.
Yeah.
No, there was a gentleman, Rint. I did like the way that he went about his racing as well. So.
2 Clarks and a Rint.
Yeah.
Well, they were all brilliant drivers. That's why they were world champions. That's why they were great Grand Prix drivers.
Yes.
Johnny, Bob, Clive and Natalie, thank you very much indeed for being with us tonight. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for on this episode of Tales from the Vault. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you again soon.